the basis of today's presentation is what is content and how it fits into the marketing strategy. So first of all, we're just going to start off with a quote from Leo Burnett, who set up the Leo Burnett Company, one of the biggest advertising and content marketing companies in America and a powerhouse in their industry. And he famously said about content, make it simple, make it memorable, make it inviting to look at, and make it fun to read. And we'll go into lots of different aspects of content within this presentation and what it is, the forms that it can take, and how it affects the customer journey. But ultimately, at its heart, this is the core purpose of content. And it's something that we should strive for when we create content. It's got to be simple, clear, concise. It's got to be memorable in order to create that lasting impression on the customer. And it's got to be interesting as well. People have got to want to read and engage with content in order to have it as an effective part of the marketing strategy. So just looking at an overview of some of the topics that we'll go into. So first of all, we're going to look into slightly more detail about defining content, and then why use content marketing? What is the purpose of it within the overall marketing strategy? What is your strategy from a business perspective? What are your goals, and ultimately what are the aims that you want to achieve with content marketing? How content affects the customer journey, creating great content and what that actually involves, and the top content marketing trends. So another quote that we've got here from the Content Marketing Institute is an overview of how you would define content. So content marketing is a marketing technique of creating and distributing valuable, relevant, and consistent content to attract and acquire a clearly defined audience with the objective of driving profitable customer action. And you'll notice within that it doesn't actually pinpoint one particular form as what content is. And I think if you asked people off the street and people that aren't involved with content on a kind of semi-regular basis, what is content marketing? A preliminary response might be, oh, well, it's blogs or it's an ebook. People tend to think it's the written form when actually content marketing is really all-encompassing. It's kind of seeded all throughout different areas of the marketing mix. It's a really broad term, and ultimately, as we said before, it's got to be valuable to the customer, it's got to be relevant, and it's got to attract and acquire a clearly defined audience. That's really important, and it's something that we'll look at a bit later on. And ultimately, the purpose of content is to drive profitable customer action, lead generations, and get customers involved with your brand. So a bit more about defining content. So there's a couple of kind of key takeaways about content. So one purpose of content is to develop a relationship with the customer. It's building that brand loyalty, and it's making customers aware of who you are and creating long-term customer relationships. And similarly to that, we also have developing brand credibility. So it's putting yourself in the position of being an expert or a thought leadership in your field. And it's saying we have a particular service or a particular product that is the best, or it can solve this particular problem that you might encounter. It's making you stand out amongst the competition as being relevant and being particularly useful to the customer, and making yourself known to them for that. So works in any medium. So again, this is a point that we'll look at a bit more, but content can cover a really wide landscape. I'll show you a chart on one of the coming slides showing just how vast content is and how many different forms it can take. And measurable. So content, in whatever form you choose to use it as part of the marketing strategy, has to be measurable. It has to have some form of impact. So whether that's the number of listeners that are tuning in regularly to a podcast, whether it's the number of people engaging with a social post like a survey or a poll, or whether it's the number of people reading a technical guide that you've created, content marketing needs to have a measurable end goal. Promoting audience interaction, again, this is a really key point for content marketing. Somehow the customer has to involve, and that's how you know that you have an effective content marketing strategy. So it could be a customer reading an article that you've put out, it could be somebody inquiring about a particular service, or it could be buying a product. At the end of the day, the point of content marketing is to get the customer to interact and engage with you as a business. Conveying a particular message is really important. So some people think about creating content just for the sake of creating content, or people go the other way and they just create content that's purely salesy. It's just pushing a product or a service. And people aren't necessarily attracted to that. They can tell that quite quickly when they're reading content that it's just created for a sales perspective. So you want to get a particular message across. So it might be making customers aware of a new service that you're launching, or a product that will fix a particular problem that they encounter regularly. And it should obviously promote your brand, and it should highlight that product or service, but it shouldn't do it in a way that is just pushing for sales. It should also help the customer in some other way while getting that message across really clearly. And then again, achieving a marketing goal. So there's so many different marketing goals you might want. It might be about getting involved with your customer service. If you've got kind of AI or a chatbot, it might be encouraging people to reach out and test that new feature. It might be encouraging people to sign up to your email database, to a sign up form on the website. It might be promoting a particular product and getting people to book a service or buy that product. But you have to have a specific end goal in mind about content marketing, whether it's brand awareness, say if you're a startup, just getting your name out there, or you're a trusted brand that people know and you want them to buy a particular product. So this is what I was talking about before. Everything is made up of content. It is really widespread. So you can see some examples here. So social media posts, they will contain the messaging that you want to get across about your brand, who you are, what you do, what you're advertising, what you're trying to make the customer aware of. Blogs are something that immediately comes to mind when people think of content, but again, it's only a small percentage of it. Video is something that is really taking off. It's a really effective part of the content marketing strategy, and it's a really good way to engage with customers rather than necessarily have them read a particularly long content piece. It works for some instances if you're doing kind of an in-depth technical guide, but you might want to show them a bit more about your service. You might want to have that level of interactivity, and video is a great way to do that. Again, surveys and polls are a fantastic way to engage with your target audience, find out what their problems are, find out what they want, find out what they want to be involved in and what interests them. And then you've also got things like infographics. Again, a great way of condensing content, getting messages across while also making it quite visual. People respond really well to that form of content, and it's something that is just on the rise. Podcasts, again, another fantastic way of increasing your content marketing strategy, trying something different. Podcasts have only risen in terms of value, and the number of people executing them in different businesses across the past year. Absolutely something that people are really involved with. It's quite easy to take in content that way, and it's just a fantastic way to look at it. Again, you've got live streams, webinars, and hangouts, exactly what we're doing now, discussing content in a slightly different way rather than just reading long-form written pieces. And then you've got things like images and paid ads. So you can see content is really diverse. It's a lot more than what people expect it to be. So why use content? So content is fundamental to all aspects of the marketing mix. As I showed then, it's really seeded throughout different areas of marketing. And it's really important to have that consistent brand messaging across any different forms of advertising and promotion that you're doing. Having a strategy will help you have better content which stands out. So this is why having a content strategy is really important. So I think for people that don't necessarily know the value of content marketing, they might think, oh, well, I'll just put a blog out here and I'll abandon it for a month and I'll do something then. But having that consistency is really, really valuable. It shows your potential customers or clients that you want to engage with them, that you're active, that you're aware of problems, or you're aware of developments in your industry, and that you have messages to get across as well. And it's a means to engage with customers and clients emotionally, to build that brand awareness and that brand loyalty and credibility that we talked about earlier. It's a fantastic way to develop that relationship. And again, it brings all aspects of marketing together. So that consistency, that relevancy, and that brand awareness across all different forms of content, whether that's paid ads, videos, podcasts, it's tying everything together and making sure all of the messaging is consistent. So now Laura's going to talk in a little more detail about content strategy.
Yep. So the strategy is the overarching diagnosis, guiding policy and direction. So ultimately, the strategy is what helps bring everything together to one united goal. So this was a kind of a poll that was done for a B2B marketing agency who do have clear, or they believe to be clear, content strategies in place. So this was what they deemed to be the most important when they put their content strategies together in terms of how they work together as a business. So the most important was that it aligned the team around common missions and goals. So this is the overarching point of the strategy. Really, it brings everything together. So while you may look at PPC is different from a blog, is different from social, everything needs to work together to get that message across. And it also allows you to determine the importance of which types of content to develop. So if you know your audience, you know these are their values, these are their interests, which piece of content is going to be most relevant for them, and what does that content need to say? Again, it keeps the team focused on the priorities. So if you've put a strategy together, you know what your goals are, and every single person working on the content on the different channels knows to keep it focused around those specific priorities. And again, you can allocate resources based on that. So if you know, for example, that social is a really strong content piece for your particular client, or is it about driving leads, so you want PPC, it's still important to make sure that you're getting the message across, and you're allocating resource to those priorities. It provides clarity on your target audience. So I'll go into this in a bit more detail later. I personally think this should be a little bit higher, because defining your target audience is absolutely essential. Otherwise, you can't get your content strategy right. It creates accountability. So whilst content, you may think, we can't measure content, kind of shrug. That's not the case. There's loads of tools out there that allow you to measure content. And obviously that will differ depending on the type of channel that you're using. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as well. And off the back of that, accountability and measurement allows you to focus on which metrics you should use for each type of content. Okay, Sophie, do you want to go to the next one? So this has broken down the kind of 4 key elements of what your strategy should be. So the objectives and goals, obviously, this is key. What is it that you want to achieve? So your business has goals, your marketing department has goals, and your content team your content has a goal, and all of that should work together. Your content can't be a complete offshoot and working at complete disconnect from the overall goals of the business. They all need to be aligned and working together. So to begin with, why are you doing content marketing strategy? What are you hoping to get from it? What are your KPIs, and how are you hoping to measure this? And how do you think this is going to benefit the business? Target audience. So if someone said to you now, who is your target audience? What would you be able to say, and how much detail would you be able to go into that? So for example, do you have accurate persona set up? So this is getting really, really, really in depth with who your target audience is. So it's a visual representation of who you think your ideal customer should be. So what's the demos? What are their interests? What are their values? And making sure that every piece of activity that you do is relatable and talks directly to the consumer. And then we go into the type. Once we've kind of defined all of that, that will then lead you into what type of content you want to use, what you think is the most important to achieve the previous goals and hit your target audience. So which platforms are you going to use? Have you identified and researched your key competitors? So what channels are they running on? Is it working for them? The type of content, you're looking at long form or short form. If it's social, type of posting and frequency. So when are your audience online? And also allocating budget and resource depending on where the priorities are. And then finally, measurement. So how will you measure the activity? Which tools will you be investing in, and how often will you report? So for example, whether it's GA or whether it's social listening tools, or whether there's specific tools that relate to SEO, are you keeping track of your organic listings? All these kinds of things. So there's loads of different ways to measure content. They just have to make sure that you're using the right form of measurement for each type of content. Okay, Sophie. So this just goes into a bit more detail about from the previous slide. So defining your goals. So your content goals should always align with what your overall business goals are. So for example, if you have a business goal to drive brand awareness, then reach should be your content goal. And this can be across, social is really good at driving reach, or display advertising. Even on your display ads, there is a form of content. There is still a message that you're trying to get across. Thought leadership, again, social good here in more snackable content. That's about engaging users, but it's also about outreach and more opinion-led pieces, so maybe more long-form content. And then ultimately, for every business, it's ultimately about driving sales and leads, and that's where you're pushing your conversions. So PPC, a good one here, bottom of the purchase funnel, brand awareness, top of the purchase funnel, thought leadership somewhere in the middle. So you've got the full purchase funnel there. In terms of conversions, PPC still has content. You need to make sure that the content you've got in your PPC ad is relevant and relatable to the audience, just like it is across social and outreach. Okay, Sophie?
So just taking a little bit of a look at how content affects the customer journey. So there are different stages of the customer journey, and each of these requires a slightly different approach to the content that you use and also the messaging that you use within that. So we've got awareness, consideration, purchase, and retention. So awareness, as it says, this is the very first stage. So this is brand awareness. It's getting your name out there. It's making the customer aware of what you do, who you are, and the particular product or service that you want to market. Then we've got consideration, where the customer or the client is aware of it and they want to get involved, but they're not sure. So this might be an instance if, say, you're in e-commerce, a customer is thinking about buying a product, maybe they add it to their basket, but they're hesitant about it. This is where something like abandoned basket emailers can really come in handy, because it's encouraging them to go through with that purchase. They've not quite got to that stage yet, but it's really encouraging them to reconsider, to go ahead with it. Or it could be doing more posts, encouraging people to get in touch about a particular product or service. It's just driving that messaging again. And then we've got purchase. So again, just an example for e-commerce. So this is where different forms of content like, thank you for shopping with us emailers will come through. Or it's, if somebody books a service with you, it's reaching out to them. It's having that level of customer service and saying, we really appreciate you booking with us. Here's everything that you need to know. It's different forms of content, and it's just reinforcing that credibility, that trust, and that reliability. And then finally, we've got retention. So the customer has made the purchase or they've booked the service, they've got involved with you in some way, shape, or form. And it's about keeping them on board. It's about forming long-term customer relationships or client relationships. So that might be by encouraging them to stay on your email database, keeping them updated with regular things that are going on in your company, special offers, discounts, services that they may find useful. It's making sure that they don't just visit you and leave, and it's giving them a reason to stay and to be involved with your brand on a long-term basis. So creating great content, obviously we talked a lot about what content is, but how do you actually make great content that is going to have the results that you want? So a really key point of this is having a clear brand voice. This is something that we mentioned earlier. It's having that well-defined brand positioning, who you are, what you do. A customer at the end of the day, no matter what form of content they're engaging with or reading, they need to know pretty much straight off the bat exactly what you do, what the purpose of the content is, whether that's something that they may enjoy reading, whether it's a technical guide that will go into a lot of detail about a particular product and the results that it can offer. They need to know exactly what the purpose is. They need to know what your brand positioning is, and ultimately how you're going to help them, how that content is relevant to them. So knowing your audience, who is the target demographic. Again, this is something that we've discussed. Content varies depending on the demographic that you want to reach in terms of effectiveness. So again, this is something that ties in with other forms of the marketing mix. So you may discover that for your particular demographic, social posts work really well, and you may discover that Facebook is the key way that people are engaging, expressing the most interest. Alternatively, you might find that if you were to set up video live streams, that's something that your customers are really involved with. They really like them and you get really positive feedback on them. You may find that emails have a really effective open rate and click-through rate. It's about identifying exactly who you want to target and ultimately what the best form of content is. And that's not to say that you should stick with one form of content. Obviously, it's fantastic to have a good variation of content, and having that mix of kind of email marketing, blog content, technical guides, videos, infographics, they're all a really fantastic aspect to have, but it's knowing which particular sections of content ultimately work for your business, whether that's for brand awareness or for driving lead generation. Again, creating content that will prompt engagement. So having content that your customers actually involve with. If you continually do emails and they're just not getting a lot of traction, it's looking at what can we do to make this better? How can we make this more effective? So it might be making the tone of the email slightly different. It might be adapting a slightly less heavy sales pitch and making it shorter and sharper. It might be you discover that the customers that you are trying to target aren't really interested in long form content. So maybe you adapt to making more infographics and you discover that visual content works really well with them. It's creating content that ultimately your customers and your clients are going to really like, and they're going to engage with them. And again, keeping a consistent content strategy. I mentioned it earlier, there's really no point in doing kind of ad hoc content. Of course, it's good to get your name out there, especially if it's something that is timely. So a particular, say it's a sale, or you've got a particular service that you're offering a new feature, or you've got a press release. Those are fantastic to dot throughout your content marketing strategy, but you've got to have some form of consistency in order to make sure that your messaging is reaching, whether that's through paid ads, social posts, or podcasts, whatever it is. You've got to have that consistency so that your customers know there's always something going on with your business. Ultimately, you want to get involved with them, and you've got a way of helping them. Laura?
Okay, yep, so just the last couple of slides. So this one is just to draw attention to the fact that people have a lot of content already at their fingertips that they maybe aren't making use of, or they aren't aware that could be useful. And so there's always internal content that you could look to use as well. So it doesn't need to be content that's designed from scratch. It can be pre-existing content. And so you've got your own intranet, there's company newsletters, there's any PR activity that could maybe be pushed out. Could you repurpose any existing content that you already have for an external audience to run on outreach and for publications? And do you have maybe an internal communications person that you could speak to about generating content, someone who really knows the business and knows the target audience, and I'm pushing that out maybe on your own channels as well. So there's plenty of ways apart from the kind of the usual curated and created content that you can do. There's also looking internally about things that already exist that you can make use of in the wider environment. Okay. And finally, so I've just put 4 key marketing trends here for 2021. So these aren't in any particular order. So there's influencer marketing. So this is something that's been around for a while now, and it kind of ebbs and flows, and it's generally growing, obviously, in the face of the growing use of social media. So back in the day, it used to be more about celebrities and big, really big names. But as time has gone on, it's now becoming more about kind of macro and micro influencers. So people who don't necessarily have a huge following, but they're like you and me. They're normal people. They're more relatable. There's kind of pros and cons of using influencer marketing. So one of the main pros is that it drives expertise and credibility. So if you've got an influencer who's linking with your brand, and that influencer has 2, 3, 4, 5, 10,000 fans, there's reach there. That's a whole new audience that you can tap into. And because those fans trust that influencer, that then leads them on to trust your brand. So it's about building trust and credibility through an influencer for your brand, and the importance of reach. And obviously, if you're using micro influencers, so people who maybe have 2,000, 3,000 fans, it tends to be cheaper than it was back in the day when you were using celebrities with hundreds of thousands of fans. So it's definitely something. To consider. It can go wrong. So if you're using an influencer, you need to be very clear from the outset as to what you expect from that influencer. And one of the issues is that you have, well, not issues, but you have to kind of relinquish a little bit of control. So obviously the influencer knows their fans, like your business. So they know what works with their fans. They know the tone of voice. They know the kind of message they want to get across. So you have to give them a kind of bit of poetic license to just roll with it, rather than dictating what it is that you want them to say. And for the most part, that works well, but sometimes it can go wrong and it can be quite damaging. But as long as that's kind of discussed at the beginning and everyone's on the same page, then it shouldn't be an issue. It's harder to regulate as well, in terms of there's no like set costs. It's just you kind of have to weigh it up based on how many fans they have, which channels they want to go across, and the importance you think it has to the business. And finally, measurement can also be slightly difficult with influencer marketing. But that depends again. So in terms of measurement, you'd be looking at things like social listing. You'd be looking at maybe increases your organic rankings. It can also be, if you've got an e-commerce site, about increasing sales. So there are ways to measure it. It's less clear cut than some of the other content channels. A long form content. So Sophie touched on this before. So long form content is generally something that is content that's over 1,200, 1,500 words. So short form content also works really well, but the market's quite saturated with it. So obviously it's things like email, shorter blog posts, social posts, more snackable content, which obviously has a role to play and is extremely effective in what it does. But it's also now looking at long form content. So with long form content, there's a number of advantages. It allows you to kind of get across your authority and expertise because you can go into far more detail about it's much longer, it's much more in depth. And because it's longer and more in depth, it allows you to get a lot more backlinks in, which then obviously help increase your organic rankings. So it's things like white papers, research, ebooks, webinars, tutorials, and guides, something that you can really get to grips with. So, for example, I know in the past I've looked for an answer for something and I may have found a blog post that's maybe less than 1,000 words. And whilst it touches on it, it doesn't give me the information and detail that I need. So if you're looking for a specific answer to something or you want something in a lot of detail, then it's a really good way of kind of informing and educating the user. Brand storytelling is essentially kind of what it says. So it's about how you align your values with the values of the consumer. So it's about how you tell your brand story and how you link that up with your consumers to make sure that what you're producing and what you're generating is relatable to them. It shows that you understand them and you understand what their wants and needs are, and that you are providing a solution to the challenges that they have. And finally, video. So this is one that Sophie touched on earlier on. So there's video, a bit like content, really. It's just, it doesn't mean anything in itself because there's so many different forms and they all kind of serve different purposes. So you've got your UGC, again, more snackable, which tends to sit on social channels. You've also got pre-roll. So this can sit on YouTube, so it can sit outstream, so it can sit before a video. There's also in-stream, so you have video ads that can sit within the content of a page. So if someone scrolls, a video ad can pop up. These can be interactive. People can make purchases from there. People can write and type and ask questions within the video ad itself. There's also interactive video, as I said. There's webinars, there's live stream, which is what this is, which can be recorded and then pushed out on social channels. So there's so many different ways to make use of video. And I think that's one to watch for the future as well. So just to wrap it up, it's just about bringing content together, that it isn't just about the written word. There's so many different forms of content, and if done well, they can all really work well together to produce an overall kind of content strategy that reflects the overall business goals. And that's the end.